My name is Bella, and life certainly has its way of teaching you who's in charge. Not too long ago, I would have happily told you about my marriage to Willie, radiating the joy of a newlywed. I believed wholeheartedly that sacrificing my job at Birentix Tech to focus on our marriage was the right choice. After all, isn't love supposed to be worth more than money? Birentix Tech, with its unique vibe, had more regulations than you'd find in a strict regime. One rigid rule was particularly problematic for couples, and once Willie and I were married, it put us directly in the spotlight. Our boss, Gary, didn't waste time. He set us up like we were contestants on a tacky game show, delivering an ultimatum with utmost seriousness. That evening, our discussion could have rivaled a high-stakes reality TV episode. In hindsight, love might have clouded my judgment. I caved and resigned the following day, giving up a promising career in tech to focus on domestic life. If only I had the foresight I have now, but then again, isn't that the irony of life? Fast forward to today, and I find myself cleaning up cereal spills because Willie, ever the soon-to-be promoted, can't seem to aim into his breakfast bowl. Didn't your mother teach you better? I shout towards the other room, though my words seem to vanish into the walls. His reply comes tight and defensive, as if my question was an arrow aimed at him. I let it go. It wasn't worth the argument. Once upon a time, we could tease each other without care, but now every conversation feels like navigating a minefield. Hours later, Willie is absorbed by the TV on the couch, and I'm left assessing the remnants of what our relationship has become. Are we going to talk, or are you planning a lifelong commitment to that couch? His indifference was palpable, as he didn't even glance my way. About what? He replied. I counted to 12, hoping for patience. About us, about where this mess is heading. I pushed on. He merely shrugged a gesture that filled the room with a heavy silence while the TV babbled on in the background. That was when it struck me. Our relationship, once solid like a house of glass, now lay in shambles, hit by an unseen force. All we had built seemed to go up in smoke, and neither of us knew how to quench the flames. It's strange how quickly life can flip. One day, you're planning a future together, and the next, discussing the simplest matters feels as volatile as a battlefield. I lingered, observing him. The man on the couch seemed as distant as a random passenger on a bus. The shift from indifference to coldness was subtle but palpable, like the chill of an ending summer or the bite of an early frost. I remembered how things were once easy between us, but now every interaction felt as precarious as walking on thin ice. I knew exactly how Willie liked his steak, rare but not too bloody, seasoned with meticulous care. It was something I had perfected. But on this particular day, either the oven or my resolve faltered. As he entered the kitchen, his heavy steps forewarned me of his sour mood before he even appeared. Standing there in the doorway, he surveyed the dinner setup with a predator's intensity. Life's lessons are harsh, often teaching us through loss and change rather than gentle guidance. As I stood in the kitchen, thinking about the ease of our past and the tension of our present, I couldn't help but reflect on how swiftly and silently the fabric of a shared life can unravel. Willie tore at the steak with his bare hands, disregarding the utensils beside his plate. His eyes narrowed as he jabbed a finger toward the meat. "Is this the best you can do now?" he growled, his voice gritty like coarse sandpaper. I tread carefully in my response, aware of the tension simmering in the air. "It's slightly cooler than usual, Willie," I explained, referring to the steak's temperature. "Not what?" he interrupted sharply, his glare intensifying. I pressed my lips together, holding back the thoughts racing through my mind, knowing that speaking up would only escalate things. "Look, Bella," he continued, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper reminiscent of a predator lurking in the shadows. "When I say I want my steak hot, I expect to feel the life fading from it as I cut in." He tapped the steak dismissively with his fork, echoing a judge's gavel. "This is already dead and gone." His criticism was cold and calculated, void of any loud accusations, but laden with a venom reserved solely for me. It was our private theater of cruelty, absent of external drama, just sharp, slicing words that left me feeling hollow. He pushed the plate away, his eyes meeting mine briefly, filled with a mix of contempt and resignation. "Forget it," he muttered, turning his back to me and the uneaten food. Grabbing his keys with a harsh movement, he issued one last command. "Fix your mistakes, Bella, or next time it won't just be the dinner getting tossed out." The door slammed behind him, punctuating the end of what little joy remained in our relationship. I stood alone, staring at the closed door, the click of the lock echoing loudly in the silent apartment. I exhaled slowly, looking down at the abandoned steak, feeling as forlorn as the meal before me. Approaching the trash can felt like a defeat, each step reminding me of what I was discarding. My effort, my care, my dwindling hope of making things work. To the outside world, we were a perfect couple, lauded by his parents and our friends alike. Yet behind closed doors, the reality was starkly different. Willie's demands escalated, each one eroding my self-esteem further. My days revolved around his approval, which grew increasingly rare. Tonight, like many before, the dinner table was a battleground for his critiques. "What's this?" he asked flatly, eyeing the steamed broccoli. "Dinner," I replied, striving to keep my voice steady despite his disdain. "Broccoli again? Don't you know anything else?" he scoffed, pushing the plate away. Suppressing a retort, I offered to make something else, but his sneer was quick. "That'd be a first," he muttered. His words stung, fueling a silent anger within me. As I turned back to the kitchen, his gaze followed, critical and unyielding. "Where are you going?" he barked when I moved to start anew. "I said I'd make you something else," I responded, a hint of defiance surfacing despite my fear. Willie rose abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor.
"Sit down."
"Let's not pretend you have other plans. Your world revolves around me. Remember?" His words were a harsh reminder, a verbal leash yanking me back into reality. "Yeah, I remember," I murmured, the fight draining from me as I returned to the table, each step heavier than the last. As I returned home with groceries, the silence greeted me. Not a sorry, not a thank you, just a heavy, settling silence. Willie was seated, an air of disapproval hanging about him as the evening wore on. Suddenly, he declared, "This house is a mess." His gaze swept across the room, eyeing the slightly misaligned books on the coffee table and a crooked pillow. "Clean it up," he demanded. I wanted to shout back, to tell him that a home that's lived in wouldn't meet his impossible standards of perfection, but instead, I quietly adjusted the books and the pillow, muttering under my breath about the endless work the place needed. "What was that?" he snapped, catching the tail end of my grumble. "Nothing," I replied louder, trying to sound casual, just talking to myself. He looked at me suspiciously, but dropped the subject. Later in bed, I lay awake, the darkness around us thick with all the things left unsaid and the dreams we'd both stifled. I thought about the sharp words I wished I could say, about my growing resentment, and about how the life I wanted seemed to be slipping through my fingers. We were bound, not by love, but by invisible chains of dependence and fear. They said we were perfect, but perfect was just a facade, a cheap word in the economy of our sham marriage. One ordinary day, after a trip to the store, a patch of ice changed everything. I slipped and fell hard, pain shooting through my leg like a bolt of lightning. It was undeniable. I couldn't stand it. A couple of bystanders rushed over, concerned. Trying to maintain my composure, I managed a nod when they suggested a trip to the hospital. At the emergency room, time seemed to drag as I waited for attention. When a doctor finally examined me, one look was enough for him to diagnose a broken leg. "It's broken," he stated bluntly, as if discussing the weather. The shock wasn't from the break itself, but the dread of explaining this to Willie. I texted him, "Broke my leg at the hospital," but received no response. I spent a cold, uncomfortable night in the hospital, the nurses indifferent, and the coffee stale. As soon as I could hobble, I was sent home with a stack of discharge papers and a cast as white as the snow outside. Willie was there when I arrived, his expression stormy. No words of concern or queries about what happened. His first words were, "Where's dinner?" Standing there, supported by crutches, leg encased in plaster, I lost my temper. What do you think? I went dancing. Look at my leg. His only concern had been about dinner, not my well-being, and in that moment, the full extent of the neglect and selfishness I had been enduring crystallized painfully clearly. Willie ranted as if I had broken my leg on purpose. You always have excuses, he accused bitterly. Can't even do the one thing you're supposed to, can you? I was astounded that after a harrowing night in the hospital, all he cared about was his dinner. The whole situation overwhelmed me. There I was, hurt and shaking, yet he seemed utterly indifferent. The air felt as cold as the ice I had slipped on, signaling that this was more than just a physical injury. It was a deep fracture in our relationship. Limping to the kitchen table, each step with the crutch felt like a mile. Ironically, I was still preparing dinner for my husband, as if nothing had changed. Nearby, the trash bin was nearly overflowing, a minor oversight, but with Willie, no mistake was ever minor. What's this now? Willie barked, noticing the full bin. You're home all day, and you can't even manage the simplest tasks. He stormed over, fury radiating off him, and with a swift kick, sent the bin's contents sprawling across the floor. Clean it up, he commanded. My hands trembled as I reached down, not from the pain of my injury, but from a deeper, more profound hurt. That night, sleep eluded me, his harsh words echoing in my head, mingling with the hot sting of tears. Morning brought no solace, only the harsh light illuminating the remnants of last night's chaos. Sitting at the kitchen table with divorce papers in front of me, I listened to the coffee dripping in the background. Willie stumbled in, reeking of beer from the night before. Morning, he growled, his voice rough. What's for breakfast? Without a word, I pushed the papers toward him. He glanced down, a sly, mocking smile spreading across his face. You serious? He scoffed. As a heart attack, I replied, my heart pounding yet my voice steady. He laughed loudly, dismissing me. You ain't got the guts. I already did it. Just need your sign-off, I countered, meeting his intense gaze. He leaned in close, sneering. You think you can survive without me? You're a broken bird, can't even take out the trash. I'm done talking, Willie, I said firmly. Sign the papers, or I'll have the authorities make you. He scoffed, grabbed the pen with a tight grip, and signed his name, each stroke heavy and deliberate. Tossing the pen down as if it burned him, he sneered, Good luck, darling. You'll be crawling back before the month's up, but I couldn't. This was my line in the sand, the moment I refused to tolerate any more degradation or lies. Despite everything, I smiled, because those signed papers felt like the first step on crutches toward a different, better life. Crawling's not my style, I murmured quietly. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the inner turmoil I felt, knowing everything was about to change. Over coffee, Willie mentioned casually that we needed to finalize the property split and already had a lawyer in mind. A reputed hotshot from the city near Virentix Techs. You coming with me? He stated more than asked, as if my agreement was given despite my current state. With my legs still healing and my choices seeming limited, I realized this was just the beginning of another long road. I nodded silently as Willie helped me into the car, carefully propping up my cast. Everything seemed normal as we headed down the highway, the city skyline shrinking into the distance like a cluster of miniature buildings. Suddenly, he pulled over. The wheel might need air, he mumbled, stepping out to check. Reluctantly, I got out too, leaning heavily on the car for support. He pretended to fuss around the tires for a moment. Then, without warning, he jumped back into the driver's seat, hit the gas, and sped off. I barely had time to react. Stranded in the middle of nowhere, I watched his car disappear down the highway, the sound of the engine fading into silence. Shocked and disbelieving, I pulled out my phone and hit record, calling him in desperation. His response was smug and cold. Come back, I yelled. But he just laughed, a harsh, mocking sound, and hinted that this was what I deserved for seeking a divorce. Then the line went dead. The harsh reality hit me as I stood there, the taillights of his car becoming a blurred speck in the distance. Alone, Miles from civilization, the winter chill began to seep into my bones, a cruel reminder of my sudden abandonment. Cars passed by, drivers oblivious to my plight, their indifference stinging as sharply as the cold. As time dragged on, a Jeep truck rattled to a stop beside me. Behind the wheel was Gary, my former boss, the last person I expected to see. The car's heater blasted warm air, reviving my chilled body. Gary's concern was evident as he glanced over at me. "You look like crap, Bella," he said gruffly yet kindly. "Why the hell didn't you call someone?" Shrugging, I felt the enormity of my predicament weighs down on me. "Thought I could handle it," I muttered, my voice a mere whisper. "He left you on the side of the road with a broken leg?" Gary's voice rose, a mix of incredulity and anger. "That Willie is a damn coward." I nodded, wrapping my arms around myself as I recalled the icy wind and the biting cold. "Yeah, I guess he is," I agreed. We drove to Virentix Tech, and Gary helped me up to the 5th floor of the building. The familiar sounds of the workplace were both jarring and comforting, reminding me of the life I once knew. Inside his office, Gary handed me a steaming mug of coffee, which I clutched gratefully, letting the warmth seep into my hands. "Thanks, Gary," I said after taking a tentative sip. The coffee was strong, just the way I liked it, a stark contrast to the bitter cold I had endured outside. Gary paced back and forth, his movements reflecting his agitation. "Can't believe that bastard," he muttered under his breath, still struggling to comprehend Willie's callousness. After steering the conversation away from Willie, Gary and I settled into a comfortable silence, the only sound being the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. We had a history of working together, a shared rhythm of understanding each other's moods that made the silence feel natural rather than strained. Eventually, Gary stopped his restless pacing and faced me directly, his demeanor shifting from agitation to a serious tone. "What are you going to do now, Bella?" he asked, the playful edge completely gone from his voice. "I don't know," I admitted, the uncertainty of my situation weighing heavily on me. Gary's expression softened, knowing deep down I had already made up my mind. "I'll think about it," I repeated, allowing a smile to spread across my face. Gary grunted in response, a sound that conveyed both understanding and a touch of impatience. Having a purpose, a place to be, and the support of someone who believed in me was more than I could have hoped for given the day's events. It was an unexpected turn, but perhaps it was exactly the kind of change I needed. Later, the tension was palpable as Willie approached the boss's office. The thud of his boots echoed more hesitantly today, as if he sensed the impending storm. He pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, heralding his arrival to what was once his domain. There I stood, leaning against the desk, arms folded, waiting. "Willie, come in." "Shut the door behind you," the boss commanded, his voice ironclad and unwavering. Willie saw me and his face turned pale, though he quickly composed himself. "What's this about?" he grumbled, his voice edgy, like a cornered animal ready to lash out. The boss gestured towards a chair, but Willie didn't sit. He crossed his arms, mimicking my posture but with defiance where mine held determination. "Willie," the boss began, fixing him with a steely gaze that could pierce through armor. "I always thought of you as a sharp man, but what you've done, that's the sharpest kind of foolishness." Willie shot a glance at me, a mix of fear and anger flashing in his eyes. "So she's been yapping, has she? What lies has she been selling?" "No lies needed, mate," I said calmly, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Just played him the greatest hits of your ugly symphony. You've been recorded, clear as day." The boss reached into his desk, pulled out a recording device, and slid it across the table. "Care to listen for nostalgia?" he offered. Willie's face turned the color of ash. "You can't do this. You can't fire me over what, Willie? Over terrorizing your wife, my employee?" "Oh, I can and I am," the boss interjected, his voice cold as steel. Willie's eyes darted between us, searching desperately for any sign of weakness, any crack in our united front. There wasn't a hint of weakness in our stance. "I'll take you to court," Willie spat, his voice dripping with desperation. "That's funny," I responded with a cold laugh, "because that's exactly where we're going." The only difference is I've got a mountain of evidence, and you've got nothing but lies and empty threats." The boss stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor like a battle cry. "Get out of my office, and get out of our lives. You're finished here." With those final words, Willie's fate was decisively sealed. In the courtroom, the evidence against him was overwhelming, heavier than his furious denials. The judge wasted no time, hammering the gavel down like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. "I sentence you to pay compensation, and this court grants the separation," the judge declared. It felt like the first breath of spring, chilly, yet promising new beginnings. Back at my job, I slipped into the familiar routines of work, but everything felt rejuvenated. Each keystroke was a brick in the reconstruction of my life. Every friendly good morning was mortar, and each completed project added another pillar to the new foundation I was building for myself. "Bella," my colleague Harold said, breaking into my thoughts. "Must feel weird, huh? Getting everything back." I swiveled in my chair to face him. "Weird doesn't begin to cover it, Harold. It feels like I've come back from the dead." Harold chuckled, his laughter warm and hearty. "Zombie Bella, back for revenge, huh?" I cracked a smile. "Something like that. Only this time, I'm not taking any crap from anyone." "No more misses, that's the spirit," Harold agreed, nodding. "You know we've all got your back here, no matter what." I nodded, feeling the genuine warmth of the office. It wasn't just the heating, it was the camaraderie, a shared fortress against any storm that might come our way. This new chapter wasn't just a fresh start, it was a reclaimed life, and I was ready to live it fully.
My name is Cecilia. I'm a 29-year-old company employee, and this means I'm getting older still. I met Andrew, a year older than me, through friends, and we decided to marry 6 months after we started dating. Andrew, who made a name for himself in tennis during his student days, is an active person who continues to play tennis even now. As I was in the tennis club during my student days, we immediately found common ground. Once we started dating, we would often play tennis together on the weekends. One day after our date, Andrew proposed to me, and we decided to get married. It's been almost 3 years since we got married. We don't have children, but we bought an apartment after getting married and have been living together ever since. Both of us work, and while we aren't struggling financially, we can't say that we're wealthy either. We're living a happy life. However, something happened that shattered my peaceful days one day. Andrew suddenly asked me to come to his parents' house. Surprised, I hurried there to find Andrew, his parents, and an unknown woman waiting for me. As I struggled to understand the situation, Andrew suddenly knelt down and said, "Cecilia, I'm truly sorry. The truth is, I've been involved with this woman here, Heather. Last week we found out that Heather is pregnant. I feel responsible for her and the baby, so I think it's better that we separate. I'm sorry, but I want a divorce." Andrew shocked me with this revelation. Exposed to his infidelity, the pregnancy, and faced with his demands for divorce, I was stunned. That was when my mother-in-law spoke to me. "Cecilia, please forgive Andrew. Yes, he cheated, but the problem lies with you too. You and Andrew weren't really a good match from the beginning, so I'm sorry. But please forget about him," she declared. Then my father-in-law added, "Heather's father is an executive at a major company, a man in a totally different position from someone like your poor father. I think you know who's more suitable for our son." I couldn't believe it. Andrew's father belittled not only me, but also my father. Normally, parents would put the blame on their son for cheating, but Andrew's parents didn't seem to think that way. Instead, they seemed to think it was natural for us to divorce and that their son had done nothing wrong. I took the divorce papers and said, "I understand what you all want to say. Being with people who have such warped thoughts might affect me too. I'm shocked at how you make it seem like I'm the villain despite Andrew's infidelity. Don't worry, I'll file these divorce papers myself. I'll leave the rest to a lawyer." And with that, I quickly left the scene. As I left, my father-in-law mockingly uttered, "A poor person hiring a lawyer? What a waste of time and money, when she doesn't even have any. She shouldn't bite off more than she can chew. Ha, ha, ha." Ignoring him, I left his parents' house and immediately went to City Hall to file the divorce papers. At least I was able to end my marriage with Andrew the next day. Surprisingly, Andrew and Heather came to my apartment. "Oh, you're still here? You haven't even packed your things. You're taking your time, aren't you?" Andrew asked in surprise. Hearing this, Heather also looked at me curiously. I was furious at Andrew's words. "What are you talking about? You're the one who should be taking it slow. This is my house, so you should be the one to leave. The movers are coming soon to take all your belongings to your parents' house. If there's anything you don't want them to touch, you should take it now," I retorted. Hearing this, Andrew suddenly panicked. "Well, what? This is my house. The ownership should be in my name," he exclaimed. I was dumbfounded. After all, this apartment was bought in my name. I had already told Andrew about this and about my family's background before we got married. But it seems that Andrew is the type to conveniently forget things that don't suit him. Perhaps this carefree nature is why he was easily swayed by Heather. I showed the deed to the apartment, and my name was clearly written on it. Andrew's face quickly changed upon seeing it. Meanwhile, Heather's face began to cloud over with anger. "Andrew, what is this all about? This is completely different from what you told me before. Were you deceiving me?" Heather began to confront him. "This is strange. What's happening?" Andrew responded in confusion. "That's not an answer. Explain yourself." Heather pressed on. "First, this is my house, so please take your argument outside. And just so you know, Andrew has various debts, so if you're planning to marry him, be prepared for that burden," I calmly stated the facts to Heather. Hearing this, Heather seemed about to say something, but I didn't care and kicked both of them out, slamming the door behind them. After a while, I could hear them arguing outside the door, but it eventually quieted down. About an hour later, the movers finally arrived and took all of Andrew's belongings to his parents' house. The room was now clean, and I was relaxing in the newly organized space, but it was short-lived. Suddenly, the intercom rang repeatedly. I cautiously opened the door with the chain lock still on, and my mother-in-law was standing there. "Hello? Is there something you need?" I asked. "Cecilia, why did you keep such an important thing a secret?" she questioned. "What are you talking about?" I was puzzled. "I can't believe it, but Andrew just told me that this apartment is in your name, and that your parents are the owners of that famous restaurant chain," she continued, clearly in shock. It seemed Andrew finally remembered my family's circumstances. "What about it?" I asked coldly. "If I had known, I would never have let this divorce happen. A daughter from such a wealthy family? We would love to have you back in our family, Cecilia. Please reconsider and start over with Andrew," she pleaded. I was shocked and at a loss for words at her outrageous request. I couldn't possibly agree to what she was asking. "You really have a terrible way of thinking about things. Am I not a human being? Are you only interested in money? I'm sorry, but I don't want anything more to do with you. There's nothing more to talk about, so please leave," I said, and attempted to close the door, but my mother-in-law, infuriated by my attitude, raised her voice in anger. "Don't be so arrogant. I'm giving you my permission to reconcile your differences. Fix things with him right now. I won't leave this spot until you agree to get back together. Open this door immediately," she yelled, pounding on the door repeatedly. I decided that I couldn't handle this alone, and called the police. They came and took my mother-in-law away. Even as the officers were taking her, she was shouting something loudly, but I no longer cared to listen to her words. There was a reason why my in-laws were unaware of my family's business background. My father, coming from a poor background since childhood, continued to live modestly. Even after becoming a company president, he never considered buying branded clothes. He always took great care of his belongings and used them for a long time. Hence, at our wedding, he wore a suit he had bought decades ago. Seeing this, my in-laws assumed that my father was not financially well off and misunderstood his restaurant chain as a small, privately owned business. As a result, they never delved deeper into my father's business. Time went by without them understanding the true circumstances of my family. Days after managing to send my mother-in-law home, Andrew tried to persuade me to reconcile our differences. His persistence was incredibly exhausting. It was surprising how insistent he was, despite the fact that he was the one who proposed the divorce. He seems to have a talent for quickly forgetting inconvenient truths. I opened the door, keeping the chain lock on, and Andrew, upon seeing me, began to speak with teary eyes. "Cecilia, please, let's give it another try. Everything is my fault. I'm truly sorry. I still love you. Let's be together again," he pleaded. He then explained a sudden turn of events. Heather had apparently approached Andrew aiming to get his house, pretending to be pregnant to sway him. However, once she learned about Andrew's considerable debts, she gave up and fled. And now my husband was coming to me to seek reconciliation. "Huh? What are you saying? I don't know anything about that. How can you say that?" I snapped, unable to hide my disbelief. "After you cheated and brought up divorce, now that she's left you, you want to get back together? There's no limit to your audacity. I have no intention of getting back together with you. Don't ever come here again," I angrily added, refusing Andrew right then and there. Surprisingly, he quietly left. However, this was not to be their last attempt. Days later, Andrew's entire family unexpectedly showed up at my workplace. They were shouting, "Bring out Cecilia, get that woman out here. We know she's here," causing chaos in the office and leading to the security guards being called. I stood there, dumbfounded by the situation, but they wouldn't have things their way any longer. I worked at the headquarters of my father's company, and that day, my father was also in the office. All of my colleagues supported me. "Hey, what are you doing? This is my company. Don't just barge in and make a scene. I know everything you did to demean my daughter. Don't ever come near her again, and never set foot in this company again." My usually calm father shouted furiously at my ex-in-laws. Everyone, including the employees and Andrew's family, must have been surprised at the anger of my father, who usually only showed his gentle and calm side. Sorry. We're really sorry," Andrew's family desperately apologized. My father's stern words had immediately quieted them down as they were being escorted out by security. "Don't you ever come here again and never do something like this again. I won't allow it. You understand?" my father bellowed as they left. Hearing this, I couldn't stop myself from crying. I felt a deep sense of gratitude that my father had gotten so angry for my sake. Later, through the company's legal advisor, I decided to seek damages from Andrew's family. I sought damages for the divorce, due to Andrew's infidelity, for his persistent attempts at reconciliation after the divorce, and for the disturbance at my workplace. The total amount was substantial, and I eventually received payment from them. I also made them sign a written agreement promising never to come before me again. Andrew's family's state of affairs rapidly declined thereafter. Chased by the money owed to me and my ex-husband's existing debts, my in-laws ended up selling their home and moving to another part of town. The story spread that Andrew had committed adultery, divorced his wife, and after being abandoned by his mistress, attempted to reconcile. Facing such embarrassment, they could no longer stay in this town. While I felt a bit of sympathy for them, I also knew that everything was a consequence of their actions, so it was clearly deserved. Andrew's family never appeared before me again. Finally, I was able to resume my peaceful days. However, my father had harsh words for me as well regarding what had happened. "Cecilia," he began, "you should have recognized before the marriage that Andrew was the type of person who would commit adultery and accrue debts. Certainly while Andrew was at fault, my lack of insight was also partly to blame. Unable to argue with my father, I felt disappointed and disillusioned with marriage. I felt that I needed to give my heart a break. However, about a year later, I decided to marry my colleague, Amir. Amir was sincere and earnest in his work, trusted by everyone. I was initially attracted by his personality, but as we started dating, I was also drawn to his lifestyle. His life was surprisingly simple. He never indulged in branded items, used everyday things for a long time, but generously spent money and spoiled me on dates. His behavior was very similar to my father's. My father, who usually saves money, would splurge on family trips, bringing us joy. I deeply loved and respected my father. Realizing Amir's actions were similar to my father's, I felt that I could be happy with him in the future. Therefore, I decided to marry Amir. I was worried about being scolded by my father for remarrying within a year of my divorce, but his reaction was surprisingly positive, probably because he had heard of Amir's reputation at work and knew of his character. There was nothing bad said about Amir. And from my father's perspective as the company president, Amir seemed to be performing exceptionally well. I feel confident that Amir will take good care of you, Cecilia, my father told me happily. Amir and I were happily married. Not long after our marriage, we discovered that I was with a child. The happiest person to hear this news was undoubtedly my father. I was so glad to see my father happy. Reflecting on my time with Andrew, where we didn't have children even after 3 years of marriage, it seemed like a stroke of luck. Amir and I plan to take over the company in the future. We are currently learning the basics of management from my father. Although there are many challenges, we accept that they are our responsibility as successors. And we are working hard together. We believe that we will need even more effort for the sake of our upcoming child. Despite all that's happened, I am now very happy. Together with my family, we intend to firmly support this company in the future.